1812 had been a miserable year for the United States, save for a few minor naval victories they had suffered. Nothing but defeat and embarrassment. Suddenly, declaring war on the world's most powerful empire with only a few thousand men and a handful of ships to hand seemed like a mistake. Britain had more men, more ships, and more resources, and the will to use them to crush their former colonies. This was no longer a war about trade disputes, but a struggle for the survival of the American nation itself. The first order of business was to overhaul the leadership. Out went William Eustis as Secretary of War, and in came John Armstrong, who'd served under Washington and had been one of the leaders in the famous 1783 Newburgh Mutiny. Secretary of the Navy Paul Hamilton was also replaced by William Jones, another veteran of the Revolution. Congress then voted for another 20,000 regular troops, 6 frigates, and for ships of the line. On the front lines, William Hull's vacant command was filled by William Henry Harrison. Since Tecumseh's Indians had played such a big role in British victories in the North, Harrison's appointment had made sense. Back in 1811, he'd led the American forces to victory over Tecumseh's Confederacy at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and it was hoped that he could repeat that same success again. America's primary goals in 1813 was to break British control over Michigan and make inroads along the Niagara River. In doing so, they would seize control of the Great Lakes region. Harrison took the initiative in Michigan, while General Henry Durban continued to command in the Northeast. Durban set York, modern-day Toronto, as his initial target. As the capital of British Canada, it was a valuable and vulnerable settlement and would make for an inspiring victory for the men. In April 1813, they struck out across Lake Ontario and on the 27th attacked and captured York. The Americans stripped the city of any supplies they could find before setting it ablaze. The burning of their capital was an insult that the British and Canadians would not forget. Then in May, Durban's infantry coordinated with the U.S. Navy in one of the first successful amphibious assaults in American history to capture Fort George on the Niagara River. While most of the British troops escaped the battle, the capture of the fort was another welcome victory. In the West, Harrison's campaign got off to a poor start. He lost hundreds of men at the Battle of Ricin River in January 1813. Stories of the brutal treatment inflicted by Indian warriors on captured American troops after the battle caused a popular scandal in the press, but also seemed to harden American resolve against their enemy. Once again, American ships proved victorious where infantry had failed. On September 10, 1813, a 9-vessel fleet led by Oliver Perry sailed into Lake Erie and defeated the British fleet stationed there. In doing so, he destroyed Britain's vital supply lines into Michigan. In one afternoon's battle, Perry made Britain's control of the entire peninsula untenable, and they called a full retreat. General Harrison aggressively pursued the retreating British and their Indian allies back into Canada. On October 5th, his troops caught up with them at Moraviantown on the Thames with 3,000 Americans against 430 British and 600 Indians. The American victory was a clear one. The British commander was captured and the Shawnee Indian leader, Tecumseh, was killed, which caused the collapse of the Indian Confederacy he built. It was America's greatest victory of the war so far, but this winning vessels freedom of movement. By the end of the year, virtually all American maritime warships had been sunk or confined to port for their own protection. Trade had cratered from around $100 million annually in 1807 to just $27 million in 1813 and $7 million in 1814. Government revenue collapsed to from 13 minus 1 in 1811 to 6 million in 1815. Meanwhile, as America was pushing to resolve fighting in the North, it soon found itself facing new problems in the South, among the Creek Indians, an anti-American faction inspired by Tecumseh, known as the Red Sticks, called their fellow Creek to attack the Americans in the South while they were distracted by the war. Britain secretly supported these Red Sticks who in August of 1813 overran and killed U.S. troops at Fort Mims in Arkansas. With most troops tied up in the North, it fell to the Tennessee militia under Major General Andrew Jackson to respond. The death of Tecumseh in October 1813 did nothing to deter the Red Sticks, who continued to raid American settlements and forts around their territory, but Jackson's militiamen weren't as squeamish about crossing state lines as New England's were, and so they arrived at Horseshoe Bend along the Tallapoosa River on March 27, 1814 to face down the Creek warriors. The resulting battle was a tragedy for the Creek. Of the 1,000 Creek warriors on the field, only 200 survived the battle. Jackson's victory virtually ended Creek resistance to the United States and dealt a fatal blow to British plans to open a new front in the South. To make matters worse for the Americans, however, Napoleon surrendered on March 31, 1814. This allowed Britain to pivot its full attention to America. An army of 15,000 battle-hardened veterans was shipped over to Canada with a bold plan. The British would invade New England over Lake Champlain, where they expected sympathetic Federalists to flock to their banner. At the same time, the Royal Navy would bombard the coast from Charleston to Chesapeake Bay. Another invasion force under General Edward Pakenham would land on the Gulf Coast and link up with Britain's Creek Indian allies to attack New Orleans, unaware of the Creek defeat at Horseshoe Bend. However, the most important angle of attack would come in the Chesapeake Bay, where 4,000 men and 24 warships were assembled to strike at one particular target, Washington, D.C. On August 24, 4,000 British troops made landfall at Bladensburg, a few miles north of Washington, D.C., where they quickly overwhelmed the weak local defenders. Washington had no effective defenses and no plan to repel the British. President Madison was outside the Capitol meeting with army leaders, but others, including the First Lady, members of his cabinet, and many congressmen, were still in the Capitol when the British appeared on the horizon. It was a frantic dash to escape the city. First Lady Dolly Madison barely had time to gather some of her belongings and a portrait of George Washington before she fled the White House. Anything that couldn't be carried was left behind, including the contents of the U.S. Treasury and the Library of Congress. British troops marched into Washington, D.C. that evening with only a handful of American soldiers trying to defend it. British Rear Admiral George Cockburn and General Robert Ross dined at the president's table that evening, and when they were done, they decided to repay the Americans for what they'd done to York the previous year. The White House, the Capitol building, the Treasury, and several other prominent public buildings were set ablaze, the fires lighting up the night for miles around, with its capital in ashes. And yet another British army under Canadian Governor General George Poe crossing into New York. The United States was facing the biggest military crisis since its inception. The grand American experiment hung on by a thread, and it seems the British were about to cut it off for good.